Subterranean warfare seems to be one of the preferred methods of warfare. It's a combination of bunkers, tunnels, different type of earth fortifications, offering a very low-tech solution to be able to combat a superior adversary. I mean, you can't hit what you cannot see. In terms of nuclear war, they offer, of course, the radiation shielding. The advantages are huge. In China, they consider it as part of their future strategy. 5,000, 6,000 kilometers of these things that are being built. And the Soviet Union had something like that as well. And I wish we would start building a lot more elaborate fortifications for every single citizen. There's a reason why this method of warfare has survived for thousands of years. There are military doctrines out there that call for that first strike. This is the true definition of MAD, mutual assured destruction. If such a conflict is to escalate, there is no scenario where anybody's going to win. Humanity is going to lose.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Well, we have a very interesting topic to present to you today and a very special guest back once again. Everybody knows that the potential for worldwide conflict right now is very high. And this, of course, involves the threat of nuclear warfare. And a critical component of nuclear warfare is subterranean warfare. This is also a type of asymmetrical warfare. And if the war in the Gaza Strip has told us anything, it's that even with the world's most sophisticated military, ISR, and aviational technology, defeating a fighting force that is leveraging a network of tunnels is next to impossible utilizing solely conventional methods. What most people don't realize is that there are tens of thousands of underground military facilities worldwide and hundreds of thousands of miles of tunnels similar to those that are being leveraged in the Gaza Strip. This brings a whole new dimension to modern warfare. So our guest today is somebody I've had on the channel before. If you haven't seen our first interview, I will link it in the description below. He's a cybersecurity expert with over 30 years experience in the IT industry. He has a bachelor's in computer science and electrical engineering, a master's in information security, a PhD candidate in cybersecurity warfare, and every time I read this guy's resume, I feel really stupid. He has a keen interest in subterranean warfare and fortifications. He's a prepper, he's a bunker owner, and he goes by the handle Cassandra, as derived by the Greek mythology of Cassandra, the one who could predict ominous events of the future but could not convince the people around them to prepare. So he is remaining incognito because he's much smarter than I am, as I've already stated, and he's trying to keep a low profile before the proverbial crap hits the fan. Welcome aboard once again, my friend. How are you doing today?
Fine. Thank you for having me, Nate.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to talk about subterranean warfare, and in preparation for this interview, we were both kind of scrambling because there is just so much to cover. I mean, where do we start? Where do we begin? How about we begin with the question of what is subterranean warfare? Well,
I mean, subterranean warfare, you have to look at it as sort of a sub of asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare really is a branch of warfare that has interested experts in the last 20, 30 years in particular, since the war on terrorism started after 2001. And what we have with asymmetric warfare is something that's hard to define. There's not actually a fixed definition for asymmetric warfare. Some people call it fourth-generation warfare, hybrid warfare, non-conventional warfare, guerrilla warfare. There are a million definitions. But one definition that I like a lot is sort of comes from the Eastern philosophy of total warfare, where anything applies. And subterranean warfare right now seems to be one of the preferred methods of warfare because it's offering a very low-tech solution to be able to combat a superior adversary. So subterranean warfare, basically simplified, is warfare right now that's taking place below the surface, subterranean. And it's a combination of bunkers, tunnels, different type of earth fortifications, and the use of geology and geography in a very effective way to offer an asymmetric advantage. So that's a very short intro to what subterranean warfare is.
So what are some of the advantages then of using underground bunkers in terms of military strategy during a conflict? Obviously, we're seeing them being utilized very effectively in the Gaza Strip. Could you maybe expound on their utility in that respect?
Well, actually, I mean, that's an extremely important question because when I was doing some research a long time ago in terms of asymmetric warfare from a cybersecurity aspect, I was shocked by the advantages that we never really think of in terms of what these type of subterranean fortifications offer. I'll go through a few just for example. The number one is concealment. I mean, you can't hit what you cannot see. So concealment is one of the biggest advantages where it makes all the ISR capabilities sort of neutralized or at the very least reduced significantly. Two, it offers physical protection. So in terms of the actual physical protection of the combatant, it offers them the ability to defend against kinetic threats. Also, in terms of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear war, bunkers and underground fortifications are some of the best because they offer, of course, the radiation shielding. They offer just numerous protection levels to offset the immediate and the secondary effects of nuclear explosions. But there are other aspects that people don't think about or don't really consider. One of them, I call it the asymmetric economic advantage. For example, the cost to build an underground fortification is probably economically a very small fraction of the cost of an advanced technologically superior weapon system that needs to take it out. So, for example, the cost of an F-16 and all the armaments that you need to pinpoint the target and go after it is exponentially higher than the cost of digging an underground fortification or being in a tunnel in a mountain. The cost is extremely minimal. So you could call it the asymmetric war of the poor or the developing countries or the developing adversary. So the economic advantage is something that people don't take a lot into consideration, but plays a big role if you want to sustain a campaign over a large geographical area. The other advantages it has is, I like to call it resource attrition advantage, or in this case, resource preservation. Most of the doctrines that control the design of these structures, these subterranean fortifications, focus on redundancy, dispersals, and mobility. Now, what does that mean? So let's say you have 100 assets that you want to protect. You could put all your eggs in one basket in one structure, or what they're being adopting for the longest time is dispersal. So you will have 10, 10, 10, 10, or you have 25. I mean, you could just disperse and create that redundancy. So if one of the assets is taken out, you still have a high survivability rate for the other sections or the other parts of the fortification. So it's something that is so simple. And this is a principle that we apply in cybersecurity in terms of always redundancy, redundancy, redundancy. And here they apply also the principle of mobility with redundancy and dispersal, making it almost impossible to pinpoint a target and go after it. Because, for example, if you have a network of fortifications, right, and you're going after a particular target, they could easily keep moving it from one to the other, to the other, to the other. So it's like, from a mathematical point of view and a practical point of view, almost virtually impossible to be able to pinpoint that particular spot that you're going to hit at a particular moment in time. It's extremely challenging, especially if they're taking advantage of big geographical and topographical and geological features. For example, some of these fortifications are built like Eagle 44 in Iran, or I forget the other one in Russia that's built under 300 to 500 meters of solid rock.
Is that Mount Yamamoto?
Yeah, thank you. Mount Yamamoto, and it's 400 square miles. I mean, 400 square mile facility. It's hard to wrap your head around the size, and this is in solid rock. So in terms of the dispersal and in terms of the redundancy, I mean, it's so difficult to reach. And then you look at of course, based on the information that was provided, I think, by the BBC and OSINT, the Eagle 44 Iranian Air Force base that was showcased on YouTube and many channels, they claim that it's 500 meters below solid rock. So you're talking about kinetic challenges that are just from an engineering point of view, it's just mind-boggling, right? Another advantage why people like these subterranean facilities is logistical, right? So you have your food, your water, all the resources that you need in one spot. You don't have to carry it. And an offensive or an attacker needs to carry and bring all the gear over. Versus here, you're dispersing the gear, you're dispersing the resources. You have hospitals, so you reduce casualties. You have your food, you have your water, you have your medicine, you have your energy, and also it gives you a psychological advantage. Because you're a bunker, you feel a lot more psychologically at ease than that poor soul that has to charge those fortifications, right? So the advantages are huge. And there's another advantage that people don't really pay attention to: scalability. What does that mean? A poor country doesn't have a lot of resources. They could build as many of these structures as they can, because usually the cost of labor there is quite significantly lower than it is in the West, for example. So it's a solution that's ubiquitous, easy to implement, and you could scale it at will almost in just about almost every terrain, from mountains to deserts, especially in areas that are fully exposed. I mean, underground fortifications offer you your best solution. And thus, when you take all these factors together, what you have is a force multiplier. And that force multiplier now puts the attacker at a very distinct disadvantage, because now, depending on the ratio, you need not the traditional offense to defense 3-1. You might need 4, 5, 6, 7-1. We'll go through some of the examples of the battles that were fought historically with this, and the attrition rates were just, I mean, horrifying, just horrifying. So that's why the appeal is, and probably always will be there, in terms of why is it that certain entities or countries prefer these underground fortification, and like in China, they consider it as part of their future strategy. And the Soviet Union had something like that as well, where every building they built was, well, not every, but the bulk of the buildings they built were dual use. So you would have a building, for example, a residential building, but it had to have its own water well, its own water pumps, and it had its own shelter. So, of course, that's a byproduct of the Cold War and all the unpleasant events of that time. And China right now is adopting probably one of the most ambitious programs in the world in terms of tunnel building and shelter building. And it's emphasizing the dual use between civilian and military. And I mean, in terms of protecting people, that actually makes a lot of sense, because you have natural disasters, you have all sort of things that these fortifications could help. It doesn't need necessarily to be just only for military purposes. It could be used for many other purposes.
Yeah, it's interesting, the cultural differences, because here in the West, talk of underground bunkers is either relegated to the realm of conspiracy or tinfoil nuttery. You're preparing for the end of the world. But in other cultures, it just makes perfect sense that the best way to erect a fortification is not to build a castle, but to go underground where the fortress is already there. And it's a poor man's castle, if you will. And like you said, you talked about cost-benefit ratio, scalability, and why it is such an effective force-multiplying asymmetrical tactic. And one of the problems, as you indicated, was pinpointing exactly where the critical points underground actually are. Because we might know that Mount Yamamantu exists, but we don't know how far tunnels extend from there in all directions. So even if you were to somehow be able to level that mountain complex, for all we know, there are tunnels for hundreds of miles in all directions extenuating from there that we would not be able to accurately be able to identify and neutralize. And I think the government right now is aggressively trying to pursue a technology that's going to allow them to detect these subterranean fortresses underground. In fact, when we had Ron here from Atlas Survival Shelters, I can't disclose the name of the company who's working on that technology, but it's one that everybody knows, put it that way. It's one that has their hands in a little bit of everything, we'll say. So This is such a vast undertaking that's being pursued by so many countries around the world, and people don't understand the scope of what exactly is happening. I mean, I just learned of this thing called Project Iceworm. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but this was a top secret U.S. Army program of the Cold War, and it aimed to
Greenland.
build a network of mobile nuclear missile launch sites under the Greenland ice sheet, but they scrapped it because they realized, oh, the ice sheet's melting. But what was interesting about this is that if fully implemented, the project would cover an area of 52,000 square miles, and, which is insane to even wrap your head around that. That's almost like, they say it's 3 times the size of Denmark. And that this was all going to be done under the cover of Camp Sentry. So one has to wonder, what bunker complexes out there already exist. The technology nowadays is far more sophisticated than it was throughout the Cold War. And we can only imagine nowadays how extensive even our own government must have very elaborate preparations that, of course, they're keeping confidential for national security purposes. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd like first to touch on something you mentioned that I think is extremely important and is underestimated by a lot of people. And I'll approach it as a researcher from an engineering point of view. When you talk about complexes like Mount Yamanato, for example, in Russia, what sometimes Hollywood does not do us a favor in terms of the people. When you say bunker and bunker buster, for example, you always think of, well, there's this big cavern room and there's this missile that's just going to pinpoint and nail this thing right at dead center, and aware of all the intricacies and the engineering difficulties that are involved in this. Because, for example, think of it as a cake, right? Think of these structures, because most of them are actually layered and they have defensive measures that are taken against penetrating kinetic objects, right? So, for example, if you think of a cake with 20 layers, okay, you are technically trying to find this piece of almond in this middle of this cake, and you want to pinpoint to detonate at that point. How would you know how deep it is, right? Because don't forget, some of the measures that are being used in some of these bunkers where they have actually fake ceilings, multiple mixed density ceilings to trick any sensors, empty caverns that are decoys, right? So, they put a lot of decoys that will give the seismic signature, for example, or the underground radar signatures to resemble what the real target would look like. I mean, these are old technologies. These are not new, let alone, of course, the advent of new technologies in terms of the new material, new types of concrete, new type of, so people probably, if they would know the amount of engineering and scientific difficulty in defeating such a fortification, they will be a lot more appreciative of how formidable of an adversary this is. And that's why cyber warfare is one of the most effective methods against these fortifications, because an example of Stuxnet, right? The odds are of trying to strike that Iranian facility with a kinetic solution would be infinitely more difficult than them trying to get that Stuxnet worm in there. And it did an incredible job in terms of delaying the program for years. And it did the same damage a kinetic instrument would do, but significantly, it was a lot easier. And the technologies used in cyber attacks are still applicable. And we'll talk about the points of weaknesses of these structures at some point. But back to your point about the size of these fortifications, if I didn't forget the question, the size of the fortification or the extent of them, it's enormous. I mean, you could go back to BC. I mean, you're talking about to a period in China where there was a project that built by General Yin, I think, in northern China, and it was 25 by 65 kilometers, covering an area of 1,600 square kilometers, and they had tunnels that were hundreds of kilometers long at a time where basically it was the human hand that did it. And they just uncovered recently the Cao Cao tunnel, of course, Cao Cao being one of the legendary, not just a brilliant diplomat and military tactician, but also a literary figure that's, his poem and his poetry is world famous. But they just uncovered some of the tunnels that he was utilizing in his defensive and deployment tactics. So these tunnels are not just used sometimes to hide things, but they are to hide from attacks, but they're actually used to conceal troop movements. Something that South did thousands of years ago, and something that the Maginot Line in France, on the border between France and Germany, did, because the French calculated that they need about 2 to 3 weeks to deploy their troops. And if the Germans were to take any hostile actions, the fortification, which was, I think the Maginot Line was about 14 or 1500 kilometers long. That's about 900 miles. And it reached 20 kilometers in width. So and it was designed specifically not just to repel attacks, but also to conceal the deployment of troops and the number of troops. So in terms of scope, you have from east to west, of course, the Ho Chi Tunnel in Vietnam are world famous, and just the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Union, there have been just numerous fortifications. So to answer your question, the extent, how widespread, I would say it's quite ubiquitous and very, very common.
Interesting you talk about concealing troop movements, because in a day of, the space age, space warfare, satellites, very sophisticated ISR technology, it is very hard to conceal troop movements, and making maneuver warfare very difficult. Like, it's very difficult to misdirect your opponent. So, this is why we're playing all these games, and we're finding ourselves in just a good old-fashioned trench war in Ukraine. But, I think it's often underestimated that it's not only about wartime, it's just about the efficiency of traveling in that underground dimension, which is why we have subways. It's why Elon Musk is working on the boring tunnel company, and why he's wanting to make roads underground, because it's just a far more efficient mode of moving equipment and supplies. So the logistical advantages of this are numerous.
And to confirm what you're saying, you look at the subways in some of the countries, like, for example, let's say Moscow. The Moscow subway was built from the days of Stalin with a dual purpose from day one, which was to be a transportation and communication line, but also to serve as a bunker in case of war. And that still carries till today, where the subway system in Moscow and in Russia is actually very well fortified in terms of a traditional type of attack. And I think some areas are 30, 50 meters below the streets. And they're all been equipped during the Cold War and dating back to Stalin, with numerous type of support facilities to support people living down there.
And you talked a bit about the various strata of the buildings. I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more on exactly how some of these facilities are constructed to withstand various threats.
Well, I mean, there's
I
just
know
a mere
it's a
there's
very
just
broad question. Yes.
It's infinite, but I mean, let's just take a vanilla example, right? So depending on your geography and topography and geology, those are the three main driving forces, right? Most of these structures are built in mountains, in mountainous areas, or in existing limestone caverns, or as we saw in Solidar in the Ukrainian conflict, they were built in salt mines. So usually they try to rely on geography first, because geography and geology is very, very difficult to beat. And then they basically build in it depending on the purpose of the fortification. They build into it the survivability, sustainability, and all the conditions that are needed. Some are very temporary. They're just for a battle, like in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, for example. Dien Bien Phu is one of the most famous fortification battles of modern time. It was fought in 1954. And just to give a little bit idea about how fortifications could be permanent, semi-permanent, or just temporary. So in Dien Bien Phu, which happened in 1954, it's in the first Indochina war between France and Vietnam. The French has built this huge fort. It was a series of 7 fortifications put together, permanent, with an air base and everything else. And the intention was to block the Viet Minh, the predecessors of Viet Cong, to have their supply routes between Laos and Vietnam. So they put it right dab center in the middle of their transport lines. And they put it in a valley. These fortifications were in a valley between 2 mountains. So they picked the right geography, the right topography, and they figured it's impervious and nothing could be done about it. Then now we enter the offensive side of fortification. General von Giab, who's probably one of the most brilliant generals of modern history, noticed that these mountains on both sides are basically impassable. They're forested, so they were not defended. And this is a miracle. They were able to actually on their backs pull all the equipment, everything they need, go into these mountains and dig tunnels in the mountains to hide the artillery. So it was an incredible physical feat to even go over the mountain, reach the forest, and then to dig these temporary tunnels that they hid the cannons in, the artillery. And they were able to go with direct fire against this Dien Bien Phu base, and they were able to just fire a few shots and retract into this temporary, what they call uh, ant hole or something like that. So that simple technology of this simple tunnel to hide the cannons, it was said that after 54 days of battle and the defeat of the French, which was really the final battle that got them out of Vietnam, not a single cannon that the Vietnamese had were destroyed because of these makeshift tunnels. And when they had finally attacked the main base, they used underground tunnels to dig underneath the fortifications and mine it and then blow it up. So
Wow.
the yeah, so it was incredible until today. By the way, when you go to visit for tourism purposes, they left the HQ explosion. You could see the photo crystal clear. They put 2,100 pounds of explosives underneath it, and they blew it up. And that hole till today is there, and it's part of the tourist attraction for the area. So that's an example of how you have defensive fortification and offensive fortifications working, and the advantage and disadvantage that they both have.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, that's a classic example of using it, like you say, for offensive purposes. Oftentimes we just think about it for its defensive utility, but that's incredibly innovative to tunnel under something and then essentially blow it up is next level stuff. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of in Gaza is where these guys are tunneling under or, flanking the Israeli forces and taking them out from the rear. And so in the context of global warfare then, how do you think these bunker systems are going to factor into government's continuity of government plans for the big one? Because I think, there is that potential. And as I stated at the beginning of this talk, most people underestimate the extent, as we've just basically barely touched on, the scale of some of these facilities. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about, what are some other methods in which governments might conceal the development of these. But how do you think that factors into government continuity and command and control? We're familiar with things like Raven Rock, Cheyenne Mountain, Mount Weather. But, what is your perception? And maybe you can just explain to people how it ties into the global strategic calculus.
Well, I think it's an absolute necessity. I don't think it's an option or something to even think about. I think you have to have it because the command and control center and the leadership is the single most important glue that's going to hold any country together in times of conflict. So even if you approach it, I mean, first, let me start, for example, just to give an example, the commercial level. On the commercial level, many companies have disaster recovery and business continuity plans, right? And that's why you see some of these old bunkers from the Soviet days, the Cold War days, that have been converted into these incredibly massive data center or server farms, where basically their data is protected. And now a lot of insurance companies and a lot of businesses demand that high value data is protected under certain type of classification. So you can't just put it in a normal, it has to be something very secure. And we could take a look at the Swiss Vault, or I forgot they changed their name, but when I lived in Switzerland, the company name was the Swiss Vault, which was a converted nuclear bunker in Switzerland that basically houses today some of the most sensitive and advanced commercial data there is. So to project that into governmental level, the need is much, much higher because you're talking about the government has all the important information, our healthcare information, our everything. So you
Yes.
have to do whatever you can to protect it with tons of redundancies, dispersal, and all sort of protection techniques in the most secure places. So if you ask me how does it play, I think it's vital. And I also think it acts as a deterrence, because if your opponent knows that let's put it this way, your main assets are so well protected that they cannot reach, that could dissuade them from thinking of a decapitation strike, for example. Or they think that they could attack you at a whim. If they know that there is no chance in heck that they could take you out in terms of a leadership of a country, that could act as a deterrent. So here, it's definitely where defense here serves to negate, I mean, really, that first decapitation strike fear that I think should be in modern day, should be really front and center in terms of risk assessment and threat analysis.
Perhaps you can tell us a little bit how your cybersecurity background dovetailed with this interest in subterranean military facilities.
Okay. Well, I mean, being in cybersecurity, I mean, the data is one of the most important things. I mean, especially nowadays, data is the new oil. It's more valuable than gold. And when I lived in Switzerland, that was really my first exposure to the bunker culture, because in Switzerland, people don't realize it's probably one of the few countries on the planet that it's federally mandated that every citizen has to have a protection bunker, whether it's on the state level or the cantonal. Canton in Switzerland is the same as a state in the US or a province in Canada. They have to provide protection, and in certain areas, you cannot get your building permit without having a shelter. So it's part of the DNA, part of the culture. And I think, if my memory serves correct, they have 120% coverage of the citizenship. So they have actually a 20% excess in terms of, and when I lived there, this is, of course, the height, the peak of, the good mood, I call it, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, because you're talking about 2005, 2006.
Yeah.
There, so many of these old bunkers have been converted to data centers, server farms, because don't forget, in the alpine areas, you have a lot of these old nuclear bunkers that had access to cold water, which is important for cooling down servers and cooling down the hardware. And it's very protected against EMP, which is extremely important for data protection and electronic protection. So in terms of cybersecurity, these bunkers are the ideal, really, data centers to protect high and sensitive data and information. And of course, not just that, but I mean, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of these bunkers were converted into cafes, bars, nightclubs, homes. I mean, they've just been used for every single thing you could ever imagine. But data center was extremely important. That's one. And two, also from a cybersecurity point of view, part of my research later on in my career was in regards to the asymmetric aspect of cybersecurity and cyber warfare. And when you look at these facilities, one of the best ways of defeating these facilities is the cyber security aspect. So if you look at it from an asymmetric warfare angle, you look at somebody as like a researcher like myself, you look at Stuxnet as the perfect type of model, because the biggest Achilles heel for all these facilities is their connectivity. And whatever applies in cybersecurity really applies to a certain extent here. And let me explain why. For example, cybersecurity, part of cyber attacks or cyber warfare, is that you have the human being through social engineering as an attack vector, right? Well, guess what? These facilities have people that work there, right? So that's an attack vector, right? That is in cybersecurity doctrine. Also, any connectivity, they got to be connected to the outside world through somehow, right? Of course, it's not just fiber optics, but nowadays they have satellite dish, but anything is hackable. Pretty much just about anything is hackable. And the computer system there. So one of the things that, in part of my preparation for my research is I was looking at all these things, and, these underground fortifications kept popping up as, ideal places to hide or protect your servers, your assets, your electronic warfare capabilities. And, some of the best ways to take him out is electronic warfare, cyber warfare, and whatnot, because the kinetic is a lot more difficult than most people think. I mean, obviously, I'm not a military expert, and I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I am just approaching it strictly as a researcher in terms of what are the implications of a cyber attack solution or cyber war solution on a fortified facility, And just like I said, the examples of the Stuxnet and other worms and viruses and malware that could potentially be able to serve a better purpose than a kinetic solution. So
Yeah,
that's
because
and yeah, and that's when I lived there, and that's when I started actually personally thinking about buying my own bunker. And it took us, I don't know, 2 3 years to find the ideal one, and it was extremely difficult, but we did it at the end.
yeah, because really the only way you can penetrate these bunker complexes is by having somebody who's compromised. And so a big portion of, I was speaking with another hacker at one point in my YouTube career, and he told me that like one of the, like half the time is just spent doing like private investigation work and trying to, figure out information about the people who are working at these facilities so that you can somehow get them to bring something in, which will be the attack vector to bring the place down.
It, exactly. I mean, if you have a facility that has thousands of people that are working there, whether they're knowing or unbeknown to them, social engineering is a very, very, very real and effective weapon in the arsenal of cybersecurity attacks. And all you need is just one person to be compromised, knowingly or unknowingly, and that's compromises potentially the entire facility, or at least a part of that facility, and then it serves as a an entry point, a spearhead, where you could start your lateral movements from that system to another system that may be a little bit higher, and so on and so forth. But definitely, once you're in, you have a lot better potential of starting moving horizontally and vertically across the system.
And this is why intelligence is so important, because I know that the Iranians claim to have discovered information on a lot of Israel's top secret facilities. That was something that was just talked about, a story I heard about a week ago. And, if you have like the blueprints, or if you have somebody on the inside who is able to relay information about the layout of these facilities, I mean, that in itself is such critical information. And it's really one of the only ways that you could potentially neutralize these facilities is first by knowing where they are, how they're laid out, where everything is. And then you still have the problem of trying to, I mean, right now they're trying all kinds of things like flooding tunnels and collapsing tunnels. And I'm sure they're employing various robotics, autonomous technologies in order to scan, and like drone-like technologies. But it's a whole other realm of warfare that not a lot of people truly appreciate. And I know you've done like a part of your PhD. Was it your PhD thesis, or that you?
Yeah, I research on my PhD. Yeah.
Yeah, and you were researching the Chinese
Oh yeah.
underground tunnel systems.
Yeah. I mean, what I mean, everybody's familiar with the Chinese Great Firewall.
Yeah.
And part of the research revealed that there is a Chinese Great Underground Wall, and most people are not aware of this. And it's actually, there was a research document done by, I think it was 2010 or 2011, a very famous research document that basically, I think it was done by Georgetown University. Dr. Philip Carver, I believe. It document is all over the internet. It's open source. It's nothing classified, and it's a research document everybody could access. And what was absolutely astonishing was the size and scale of the civilian and the military program for building these fortifications and shelters underground. You're talking about 5,000, 6,000 kilometers of these things that are being built, and built at a rapid pace. And you're talking about airports underground. I mean, you're
Wow.
talking about planes, bomber jets, fighter jets, and so on and so forth. It built into the mountains, and the runways just take you straight out. So
Wow.
just think about the size and the scope of something like this. It's just enormous. And this is, like I said, it's public information. Anybody could check this information out. But in terms of back to the kinetic solution, the engineering challenge is formidable, let alone when it's spread across a country as big as China. or as big as Russia, where, like you said, even if you had the blueprints, even if you know exactly the 3D model of that building, still it's going to be a challenge to defeat all the countermeasures, because when these type of facilities are built, the military grade ones, they have countermeasures that are built in to defeat most of the kinetic solutions that are known, like that most people know. So it's a formidable challenge, and I don't think. I mean, I've read some of the documents in that some of the research that was done by some great American scholars, and they highlight how this is an area that needs much work, much improvement, and it has not really received the due attention it needs in terms of how do you handle this, how do you deal with this, how do you defeat this. You need to develop doctrine, you need to develop capabilities, you need training, equipment, and so on. And probably our best hope in the future is going to be really robotics and cyber security, cyber attacks, because robotics in the future, I mean, they could shrink to a miniature level. I mean, I don't want to get into the nanotechnology because it's a very deep rabbit hole, so to speak. But nanotechnology is real. Nanotechnology exists, and nanotechnology has been applied in a lot of ways. And I think eventually, these miniature bots, unmanned vehicles, and in conjunction with a lot of sensory technologies, they might offer the only really hope. But then the challenge would be, how do you scale it up? I mean, if you have an adversary that has 1,000 of these facilities, how do you scale that solution up? And so, I mean, it's a lot more challenging than people might think. And there's a reason why this method of warfare has survived for thousands of years. I mean, think about it in terms of modern conflicts. It survived World War II, the Maginot Line. Then you have the Vietnam War, the Indochina First War, Second War. Then the Korean War. I mean, the Korean War. I think in 1978 or 68, if my memory is a little hazy, they uncovered a tunnel from North Korea to South Korea that had the flow rate of 30,000 troops per hour. Now, I don't know how you could flow 30,000 troops per hour. That sounds like a crazy number, but yeah, and it was like 2 miles long, and this is in the 60s or the 70s. So imagine with the modern equipment, modern boring technologies, modern geological mapping, because I mean that's critical when you have a geological map of the area. I mean, technically, North Korea could be all the way dug into the south for all we know. I'm sure the experts are working on this and they have something to mitigate it, but it's just theoretically, digging ground is not a high-tech topic. It's nothing that is so difficult. I mean, we've seen. Just look at the channel, for example, that's been dug between the UK and France, and that was many, many years ago. Now with the technologies that's available, it's nothing really there is no barrier to entry for any combatants. It doesn't even have to be a state actor. This is part of the asymmetric research I was doing, that with cyber warfare, the same thing as with tunnel and underground fortification, you don't need to be a state actor. They could be cartels. They could be, I mean, many, many smugglers and cartels, drug cartels are trying to smuggle things between one country and the other. So and they have the resources, and you could easily have these drug tunnels, smuggling tunnels from one country to another. So it transcends. So it's like with cybercrime. Last time we had a chat where I mentioned that how cybercrime is $10 trillion industry, and now you add and part of that, it's the ubiquity of it. It's how easy it is to have and to execute. And the same thing with these tunnels. It's really something that requires some sort of a technological breakthrough to be able to detect them and to defeat them. And I'm sure the point will come, but as of now, I personally am not aware of something that is quote unquote cookie cutter and foolproof. And this is going to represent a huge asymmetric challenge for us if we go into any overseas conflicts. Because if you look at any of the modern or the current events that are happening around the world, tunnels are playing a very, very big role in it. Look at the fortifications in Avdiivka. Look at the Azovstal. Look at Solidar, right? These places, Bakhmut, yeah, I mean, these places were so well fortified and so well defended. It gave the defender a significant advantage in terms of slowing down any offensive operations against them. And mind you, they don't have the budget we have. So imagine if we start to do things like that. I mean, it will be very effective. Look at the Middle East. The Middle East is pockmarked. I mean, it's just I mean, from the civil wars to the actual conflicts right now. You have every grade and every type of tunnels and fortifications underground, and nobody's really sure. There's no real research because it's obviously very highly sensitive information, and the conflict is still ongoing. But in terms of how these tunnels are dug, how are they defended, all these things are still an enigma.
Yeah, and like even just looking at the Gaza Strip situation and Azovstal, we're starting to see now how slow modern warfare actually is. Like I think a lot of people have this very simple, one-dimensional, top-down view of things, not taking that subterranean dimension into account. And I don't think any of us did when these wars started. Now, can you extrapolate that to a global warfare scenario? Because I cannot imagine how we would ever fight a war with a country as big as the Chinese, who have these vast underground cities, these networks, when you're looking at these small little locations. Israel has the most sophisticated technology in the world at their disposal. And what are we, like almost 4 or 5 months on now? They're still, starved to make much progress in the grand scheme of things. So, how is this really going to factor into a global conflict? Is this what's actually preventing it? Because the United States must realize that, I mean, there's no way you're going to defeat the Chinese or the Russians for that matter, unless, nothing short of like a decapitation strike where you were able to take out the leadership and then somehow have people on the ground ready to develop a new government. I mean, that's really the only way you do it. You have to win people ideologically, politically. There is no way to effectively win a war, especially when we understand this subterranean component. Do you have any thoughts on that, like how this might factor in and act as a bit of a deterrent then? Because if we know that, okay, we drop some nukes, now what? They have these massive underground cities that they're going to rebuild from. For all we know, they have nuclear reactors underground. They're going to power the whole operation. How do you think, like if you're a general, and I'm asking you a big question here, but just for the sake of our musings, how do you look at this situation, and what do you think they're thinking when they're making these moves, these geopolitical moves?
Well, that's a question and a half.
Yeah.
Let me try to take a stab at it. First, I'd like to start, and before I answer this question, by putting the following disclaimer that whenever I mention a country name and the country resources and assets, by no means I mean it in any negative or derogatory way. I mean it in purely a research, factual, engineering way that 1 + 1 = 2. I'm not saying it's good or bad or either. I'm just strictly stating that such an asset exists in such a country for such a purpose. But I'm not trying to cast judgment or pass judgment on any country or any culture. I have respect for all humanity, period, across the board. So now to get to your question, let's take, for example, Kavinsky Kaman, Mount Kavinsky Kaman, and I'm sure I misspelled it, in the Urals. It's considered the house, or rumored to be housing the Russian perimeter or the dead hand system. And for those that don't know what perimeter is, it's a software, it's a system, it's an integrated system. It's called the dead hand because it was designed specifically during the Cold War era, or conceptualized during the Cold War and developed thereafter, in terms of if there is a decapitation strike and the entire Soviet leadership was taken out, that this system, if it doesn't get guidance from the allocated people or from the specific people in the chain of command within a specific amount of time, that computer doesn't get a response, it will execute secondary protocols and pre-planned launches. It will launch everything. It will launch everything. That's the whole concept of the perimeter or the dead hand system that the Soviet Union and Russia built and still have. Well, we don't know that certainly, but I mean, that's what open source research says, right? And it sits below 500 meters or 300 meters of solid rock in the Ural Mountains in a facility that is shrouded in mystery till today. And I know the New York Times and Washington Post ran a few stories about it in terms of why is Russia building such a huge facility at a time where we're supposed to be friends. And this article was many years ago. But this facility, the information about it is very limited for obvious reason. Because, but back to, and that brings me back to your question in terms of decapitation. The short answer is there is none. This is the true definition of MAD, mutual assured destruction. The country, in terms of doctrine, I got to tell you, there are specific and clear doctrines that are written and they're available. I'm sure all military schools have them. They have copies probably of the Russian military doctrine, Chinese military doctrine, and I'm sure that our adversaries have probably copies of our military doctrine. And it's extremely complicated topic. That's why nowadays they're trying to use AI and supercomputers. It's extremely difficult to calculate. But personally, and I'm not an expert on this, but personally, the way I look at it is this, is there is no scenario where anybody's going to win this. Humanity is going to lose. If such a conflict is to escalate, there is nobody that has any form of common sense in engineering or science or military that's going to give you 100% carte blanche guarantee that, listen, we could attack our adversary, wipe them out, and they can't do the same to us. And since nobody could guarantee that, then the whole concept, I mean, that's what kept actually the peace during the Cold War, was this mutual assured destruction doctrine. And the fact that people now are trying to tamper with that is very, very disconcerting and very troubling, because technically, I don't want to scare people, but there are military doctrines out there that call for that first strike and call for, that if it is to happen, we could survive it and so on. I mean, there are people that are mad, let's put it that way. And it's just unfortunate. But there are documents I'd rather that I don't dive too much into that area, because it's not my area of expertise. But there are preparations. I mean, you could find in an open source where people think that if we have more bunkers, we have more underground fortifications, we could stand that first strike and retaliatory strike. We could stand to win. Personally, I think it's madness, but that doctrines, that belief, unfortunately exists. And right now, you're seeing weapon systems that are tipping the scale of balance, and that actually is going to drive further the underground fortifications. And I wish we would take it as more serious matter, and we would start building a lot more elaborate fortifications for every single citizen. Because in case of a conflict like this, it's I mean, people could go and watch the 1984 movie Threads if they want to get an idea, because it's more realistic than people might think. It's really more realistic than people might think. And I wish more people would. So as far as a general, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll resign. I'll just turn in my resignation.
Well, I mean, like it's this whole other world that we, on the one hand, we don't know what is out there. And that's part of the problem, is that for all we know, the government is building these underground fortifications. And I presume any smart government this day and age would be. But there's a bit of a paradoxical situation in which, if they get the public interested in this sort of thing, then the public is going to be very concerned, and there might be pushback to some of these interventionist foreign policies that might be bringing us closer to that ultimate scenario. So whereas you have this embedded in the culture in the East, and it's not a shocker to people, it's not a shocker to the Russians that, oh yeah, we're going to have a whole curriculum that's going to involve nuclear war survival skills starting in September. But if we were to introduce something like that here, people would be shocked, and they might start to really question things and resist things, but it's a necessary step. So what I'm saying is, obviously the government is doing this stuff in secret. I mean, I certainly would be, with a black budget. They have the technology to do it. Now we can just speculate, and people will say, well, this is getting into the realm of conspiracy. But I mean, history bears that out, that of course it's going to be classified. So if you know that the threat is there, and you know that it's going to be classified, you have to presume that these facilities exist. And I'm not talking about Raven Rock or all the ones we know about. There has to be other facilities that they're doing under the cover of something. Do you have any thoughts on how they might conceal these projects? I mean, I do, like in mining, but maybe you have more
Well,
thoughts
I
on
mean,
that.
let's unpack that. It's two separate questions. One, how do you hide it? And two, how do you introduce it to the public and how do you introduce it to the masses, right? So in terms of hiding it, it's actually there's standard operating procedure more or less. Like for example, if you take the Greenbrier Hotel, it's a famous hotel that was hiding the Greenbrier bunker, and the Greenbrier bunker was to camouflage that they were building, which was a command and control center for the U.S. government. It was a continuity of government type bunker. So what happened is they built the Greenbrier Hotel. So the Greenbrier Hotel, so everybody that was paying attention, of course, it's been declassified, and people could go and stay in the Greenbrier Hotel in any time. And I've heard from some friends that stayed there. They said it was wonderful, and so maybe they could take a look at it. And I think even the bunker now is open as a museum. But that was a perfect example of they had this huge earthwork project that camouflaged building a hotel, but actually was building a huge continuity of government bunker underneath. Usually, these type of facilities are associated with huge, massive, real civilian projects close by that act as a decoy. And historically, there have been numerous examples of that. And the Greenbrier Hotel is just one of the most commonly known thing. Yeah, so I mean, you will see these type of projects all over. In Russia, they definitely use mining as one of the biggest type of thing because it is a resource-rich country, so they have a lot of mines. So they usually come up with these excuses as some huge mine, but it's actually a underground facility. And in terms of your question, do I assume that they're building these? My answer is I hope so. I really do hope so because if it could act as such a deterrence, and I think partially this is one of the reasons why Russia and China have been publicizing so much their civil program, their civil shelters program. It's almost
It's a
a,
deterrent.
yeah, it's a subtle hint that hey, if you try to hit us, a lot of us will survive, and so on and so forth, because this type of information is publicly available. So it's nothing classified, it's nothing private. But Russia and China have been over the past 10 years very, very vocal and very, very transparent in terms of revealing to the world, look at all for example, in Beijing alone, you have 1 million people already living underground in bunkers from the days of the Cold War and the 60s. And they just built another facility in Shanghai that houses 200,000 people. And they were
Oh,
showcased to everybody. And that was just
right.
one facility. And they have put it as a national strategy. So the Chinese government has put it as a national strategy that we want to create as much civilian shelters as possible. Russia has been vocal about all the drills they've been running and about the survival training that they have offered to children. And I think that's a smart thing for us to do as well. And it doesn't necessarily, if it's done correctly, it doesn't really need to alarm the people because look at Sweden, for example. Sweden has a civil defense program that's really active and advanced. And it's being introduced and taught to every kid in school almost. And it's the Swedish government went and distributed these civil defense pamphlets or booklets to everybody. So I think if it's done correctly, it could serve multiple positive reasons. One, it could deter to tell everybody, hey, we're not sitting ducks. That'll be one. And two is also give people the sense of comfort because to be honest with you, as a bunker owner, I could tell you, of course, I own my bunker in Austria, in Europe, is it has a very calming effect because it's like an insurance policy that you have that you hope you never exercise ever. But in terms of being a prepper and being somebody who's always it's part of my job, threat analysis, risk assessment, that's what I do, is you have this ultimate insurance policy in terms of anything happens, listen, within few hours, I'm away from a facility that's resilient, resistant, protected. And for 2 years, I could sit there and just not be bothered. Let's put it that way. So I think if people have, and by the way, the German government just issued a directive a few weeks ago that was encouraging all citizens in Germany to build their own shelters. And I mean, Europe, having lived in Europe for, I don't know, 15, 16 years, I could tell you that there are so many bunkers all over the place, and fortification is part of the European culture. Castles, citadels, forts, just, I mean, dotting the landmark. the landscape. I'm sorry, and there are so many bunkers that were decommissioned after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Europe that I definitely encourage people to try to get their hands on whatever they can, because it's such an insurance policy without the war. I mean, just even for civil unrest, for economic collapse, uh, it offers so many features that most people don't think about. One of the simplest things, for example, is temperature. In case of an SHTF program or event, people don't realize that when you're in a bunker, the temperature cannot drop below 7 degrees centigrade. It's what makes wine wine. Wine cellars operate between 7 to 12, well, at least for white wine. Red wine is probably a little bit higher, but the point is it doesn't go below zero. So at the very, very least, it offers what they call a stable thermal atmospheric environment. So you don't have to worry about extreme cold that could. So there are a lot of benefits, and that's why countries like Switzerland mandate, if you want to build a house, you have to get a permit and you have to put a family shelter. Now, mind you, it's small. I think the formula there is X meters per resident in the house. And you have to maintain 2 weeks worth of readiness, and it's subject to inspection. I know this because my lawyer there once was late for a meeting, and he said there was a surprise that they showed up basically to inspect if his batteries were still, or something along the lines of his batteries, or some things that he had to maintain always non-expired. So it's something that I think would definitely help people in terms of the preparedness mindset. And it will act as an overall deterrent for anybody that's thinking, hey, maybe we could do a quick one and nobody's paying attention. North Korea, for example, they have these elaborate public works projects, right? So you can imagine the amount of underground fortifications that they have. The only countries that are not taking this very seriously, unfortunately, is the West.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.